Hello and welcome to Selecting HR Software Part 2. In the Part 1 of this masterclass, previously we covered identifying what is needed, that is, what elements or modules of software we need in our HR system, documenting the key processes and the organizational rules, both of which are bringing together the information we need to configure our HR system, and also finding HR software suppliers, how to conduct your search to find the people who can supply your system. In this part 2, we'll be covering tendering, which is a method of gathering information and processing information and offers from the vendors. We'll be looking at how to compare the proposals you get and arrive at a shortlist. And then the next part of that is, with your shortlist, you then move on to product demonstrations. And that's a very vital part of the process. Our presenters for part 2. As we've said previously, HR technology or buying an HR system is one of the most important investment decisions that we as HR professionals are ever going to be involved in. So it's essential that we get the right software. In order to do this, we need to make sure our approach to the selection process is structured and sound. That is to say, minimize the possibilities of making any mistakes. Well, tendering is used a lot in public sector organizations and also large corporations. The idea behind tendering is to give a level playing field to vendors to make sure that you can compare across the whole piece and looking at submissions from potential vendors. So to put together a tender, if you don't have one, if you're not obliged to do so, it's quite a useful process of organizing the information that you're going to receive. So first of all, you'll give a description of your enterprise or organization, and then you describe what it is you're looking to get from your new software. You then go on to give what your current position is, what are we using right now, if we're using anything at all, what kind of technology operating environment is it working in, and so on, and what possible changes will you be making in the future. The next part will be describing the functionality and the features that you require with examples. These examples will be drawn from the scenarios that you've drawn together from your rules and your processes. You then lay out a timeline for when you're going to want to look at product demonstrations, dates for these demonstrations, and possible dates by which you'll be making your decision, so that it gives the vendors an idea of what their timeline has to be that they need to meet for your requirements. And also in this, you'll need to give a process for responding. In other words, to who do they send the submissions to, and in what manner they'll be sent. And one thing I would say about tendering is it should give a very fair process, but the problem behind it can be sometimes that the rigidity of your tendering process and the criteria that you're actually measuring them against may actually tend to eliminate a lot of choice. You may end up with the same style or type of vendors each time. So it's important to keep your tendering process fairly fluid and open. The structure should be in place to make it a fair process, but by the same token, you need to be able to have as much option as you can possibly get. So how do we get to a short list? You've got submissions in from your tendering vendors. How do we turn this into a short list? You've maybe got 20 submissions. Now, all of them will quote more or less on the basis of how much will the system actually cost to buy or rent? What will be the annual running costs, say, upgrading the software maintenance on the software, bringing it up to date. You may, if you want, you may want to host this software on your servers. Although right now I can tell you that 99% of the requests that I get in my consultancy, guys, are for web enabled. In other words, you get to them on a web browser and they're hosted elsewhere. Training of staff on the system, that will be a sort of a cost included, although it can vary from vendor to vendor, some included in the cost of the software. There will be the big unknown in this is project consultancy charges. This is really what it's going to cost to have the vendor's project manager sitting there configuring the system to your requirements. And that is going to vary very, very much as to whether you're ready or not, whether you've got all the information gathered together in one place, as we suggested in part one, so that when their project manager comes in, you can hand them all the configuration details and work with them in a speedy way to get that software organized. And sometimes, although not so much these days because it's become a simpler process, there'll possibly be a quotation for migrating your data from whatever existing system you've got onto a new system. The one thing to remember in all this is that vendors all have a different charging system, different models, how they charge, what they charge for. So my tip to you is to do what I do when I'm consulting, is to flatten the charges out over a 5-year period. A 5-year period is fairly typical for the life of a piece of software in this fast-changing age. So what I do is compile a grid, something like this here, getting to your shortlist. So here you'll see I've just compared 2 vendors, a very simple example. I've drawn the costs out over 5 years, the totals across on the right, various elements, rental, maintenance, training, hosting, and project costs. As you can see, in vendor B is not charging for the training, that's included in the cost, and so on. So when we come down to it, 5-year cost of your software is $203,000 for vendor A, $214,000 for vendor B. The accounting people may well tell you that project costs actually may be capitalized or not written off, or written off. So they may not figure in the final analysis. But that's the easiest way to make your comparison, looking at the contrast between the costs. Now, when you're getting to the shortlist stage, there are a few things that you really need to think of that aren't sort of within the general scope. First of all, if you're looking for HR and payroll, do you want them to be the same provider? There are pros and cons towards that, so they need to be considered very carefully. What's going to be the closest fit to what you want? And remember, as I always say, there is no perfect solution. Also, the vendor's software doesn't just match the functions and features, but has the ability to be configured to your process requirements. So as we've said before, because it has an absence module doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for your absence procedure. So configurability is very much the key to what we're looking for. You need to look for the best value for money, but I would urge you don't be put off by the budget. You know, cost isn't everything. If you've made a good business case that you need to have this software, then in a way you've made the point that it's a business priority. So sometimes you should look at it from the point of view of saying, what is going to do the job for us? And then see if you can make that fit in your budget. You need to be thinking about the future. So don't buy anything that looks as if it's going to go out of style fairly quickly. You need to look at service levels. In the case of something going wrong, what sort of service can you expect? And reference sites. You may want to talk to people who use the system already. However, the caveat is, first of all, is it the same version that you're running? Secondly, have they used it, configured it for the same thing that you're doing? And thirdly, if they bought the wrong thing or did it wrong, that's going to rather color their opinion. So always take reference site information just with a touch of reality, if you like. Now, demonstrations. And because so much of the decision process is based on the actual demonstrations, it's crucial that you actually do it right. It's probably one of the riskiest parts of the whole process of selecting HR software. And trust me on this, this is where most of what I've seen go wrong has gone wrong, apart from failure to prepare. So there's 3 types of product demos that we're most likely to come across. Going to an exhibition, having the vendors coming to your premises and demonstrating the software, and then online demonstration, although this isn't very frequent still, but it is becoming more and more popular. Well, demonstrations may all differ in location and ambience, but the factors that they have in common. First of all, the right people have to be there. And who are the right people? Well, I would suggest the project sponsors, the departmental people who are involved, and also users, and even possibly internal customers, people who may be going to be using the reports that come out of the system and so on. So make sure you've got the right people there. Second, the demonstration scenarios or the whole format must be tightly scripted and driven by you. There shouldn't be any leeway, if you like, for going off topic, showing wonderful things that you don't ask about, or losing track and losing the point of why we're sitting there in that demo. So you need to compile scenarios from all of that preparation work that you've done, prepared typical scenarios of processes and events that happen in your company, so that the vendor can actually prove that their software can do the job for you. And of course, make sure that they've got that information before the demonstration so they can prepare the correct response. So you don't get them in the middle of a demonstration say, hang on, I'm going to have to talk to the technical boys about that because I don't know what that means. Now, each demonstration has to be scored on a consistent basis. First of all, so that you get a good idea of what the different software is going to offer you, but also in fairness to the vendors who've taken their time to present to you. And that leads me on to say every vendor should be accorded the equal conditions for their demonstration. So they shouldn't be disadvantaged. You should give the same time scale to each one. And, in fairness to a vendor, if they're burning up a lot of time on stuff which isn't necessarily what you're looking for, then it's only reasonable to point it out that they are using their own time. So those are the points generally about demonstrations. Let's look at each one in a little more detail. In-house demonstrations are usually held as a follow-up to a previous discussion or viewing, maybe at an exhibition, a software exhibition or something like that. So the next step from meeting a vendor, looking at the product at an exhibition, will be to invite them in-house to demonstrate. And to do this, I prefer, if you like, a two demo approach. So the first demonstration is to get a look and feel. The walk around the software, looking at specific functionality and configurability in some areas, and then follow that up with a much longer, more detailed demonstration to home in on key processes where we have pain, things that we need to really sort out, the real points behind why we're buying this software. So, and then you can start talking about the general project approach. So, okay, how long do you feel that it will take for us to get this up and running? What are you going to need? What do we need to provide to you? What more can you do? How much is it likely to cost at the end of the day? So that's my preferred two demo approach for an in-house demonstration. things to think about in in-house demonstrations. The location. Now, choose somewhere that is airy and light, because I can tell you it can be quite demanding with attention. So you want somewhere that's going to keep people alert. Make sure that you've got necessary equipment there. So if there's overhead projectors or whatever it is, one of the key parts is if the vendor, and it's almost certain that they're going to need that, if they need internet access, make sure it's there. You don't be messing around wasting half an hour while you try and get the internet to work. Make sure you've got the right attendees, looking at duration. That, again, don't try and do more than 2 a day. Otherwise, your brain is going to get fried. The subject matter, which is the scenarios, the evaluation, which will be your score sheets, what we'll look at in a minute, and any other conditions and considerations that we need to be thinking about. Now, as I've said before, demonstrations are very intensive for your attention. You're going to have score sheets with you, which we're going to be looking at, and you are going to be making notes on the scores pretty much all the time. So I would say the first one should be not more than 2.5 hours, and the second one perhaps longer, because you're then looking at other topics such as project management, cost, project approach. That might run to a maximum of 3.5 hours, in which case you probably need a little bit of a break or something in between. But don't underestimate the power of concentration you're going to need for this exercise. Don't try and bite off. I know people have tried to do 3 or 4 in a day, and trust me, I've sat in on it too, and it really is exhausting. And after the second one, you're really not taking on board what's actually happening. Now, we talked about scenarios. Here are a couple of sample scenarios which one would draw up from your processes and rules. So as you can see, there's one: put together a report, using some dummy data that we provided or they provided, and show on that report sickness absence of such duration in such an order. Or another piece of content which would be put together a post profile of a person of grade C manager, and so on and so on. So you can look at these scenarios, get an idea of what it is that we need to be able to serve up to the vendors, so that they can demonstrate whether or not their software can be configured to meet that case. And you will score that accordingly, as we'll look at in a minute. And other types of scenarios, you can actually ask them to compile a workflow process which will sort of replicate one of your own processes. It could be raising a recruitment requisition and passing it through various ways for approval, or it could be a sickness absence process where somebody generates a sickness form and it passes through the various phases. So you build those scenarios around the work that you've already done on processes and rules. And now possibly the point that we really need to know is, how are we going to evaluate what we've seen? We need to think about these factors: user appearance and also navigability. Those are the two things that really drive home to people who have to use the system on a fairly regular basis. These need to draw a score. The presence of the right modules is obviously essential. It all adds up to the points. The ability to configure the modules to your needs, probably the biggest of the lot. And then, how did the vendor handle the scenarios? Was it fully demonstrated, partially demonstrated, or they just completely missed the point, they couldn't do it, or whatever? And here's a sample score sheet which I put together. I'm not sure, I hope you can see the small writing here. Just look at the various topics that I've put here, although you'll obviously add your own. Can the software be branded, particular to your organization? Can you individualize the home page for each user, or do you have a dashboard? How easy is it to configure fields? How easy is it to navigate? What does it look like when you look at it? Is it acceptable to a user? How did they do on the workflow example? Setting up the post, the headcount report, the absence example, and so on. And you'll see here, I've allocated points out of 20, and you'll see between 3 vendors. But you can customize this type of thing for your own requirements. But it is important that everybody is scoring the software as they look at it. And don't do it afterwards because you forget completely. And that's why I've said the demonstrations are so attention intensive. So we've got our score sheets done. What do? Pull them all together. We look at the costs from our previous work. We look at the timelines and so on, and we decide, apart from just the facts that you have, it could be other things that come into the equation as well. Do you have the right chemistry with the vendor? We know there's no such thing as 100% perfect fit, but how much are we prepared to compromise? If nothing actually, and this can happen, so, be very aware. If nothing comes close to meeting what you think your requirements are, then you need to re-examine your criteria. It may be you're asking for something which actually can't be done. Now, I have to tell you, it's very rare for modern software not to be able to cope with most things. The things they can't cope with is where you have some really arcane sort of practices or some really complex, possibly unnecessarily complex process. So look at what you're asking for again. And finally, don't even think about customization. Configuration is where you switch and configure. You can switch pieces inside the software, if you like, to meet your requirements. Customization is a whole big-scale adaptation of the software. It's costly, and it means that you are going to need extra support every time there's a product upgrade and so on. Really, I wouldn't go there. It's unnecessary. What I would say to you is if you think you need customization, think again. There's something wrong with what you're asking for. So, in summary, price and implementation time are very important, both equally important almost in this day and age. Implementation times in olden times, 10 years ago, were very, very long. Now, if you can get a piece of software, your HR software, rolled out in 6 weeks, or less, if you're very organized. You need to use the score sheets to rate what you see and score as you go. Don't sit there and look at it all, then try and mark it later. Demonstrations have to be driven by you. You drive the agenda. You set the scenarios. You allocate the time and the points. Remember, the quest is not just for the right modules, but the key to all of this, underpinning all of this, is the software needs to be configurable. And to understand whether it can be configured to what you want, you can't get away without feeding it scenarios, and these scenarios will hark right back to all that preparatory work that we did in part 1. So thanks for watching this, and I wish you good luck in your quest. And thanks for watching.